Housing is one of 4 main priorities of the decade of Roma inclusion. Housing should and need to be an integral part of improvement of life of Roma. Often housing situation is driving force for change, both for worse and for better. Yet, very often, housing is somehow left behind when we are talking about practical implementation of policies, concepts, or theories. Why is that? Is it because of lack of financial resources? Or do we really believe that if we invest sufficient energy and means to education and employment, we will somewhat solve housing on the way? Or maybe the problem is vast intolerance and discrimination of society when it comes to investments to housing for Roma. I think that these are questions that we will seek answers to throughout this 2 days conference. Without any doubt and without need for 2 days discussion, we must say that there is a need for constant addressing of issue of housing within the decade of Roma inclusion framework, not only in order to exchange good and best practices on national or local level, but to constantly remind us that housing is a human rights issue, and once individuals or group is ripped of distinguished condition for living, all aspects of life are deteriorating. Furthermore, that we need to find solutions and measures that will work for people at local level, and we need to constantly measure it throughout its implementation in order not to lose our focus, as it often happens. Ladies and gentlemen, I believe that this conference, as well as priorities of the Czech presidency to the decade of Roma inclusion, should contribute and will contribute to the effort of the decade of Roma inclusion to address issue of housing constantly. The goal of this 2 days conference hence is to exchange experiences and to discuss examples of good local and national practices, and to think what are elements of their transferability. Second, to remind us or introduce global as well as European standards and policies and practices on affordable housing. Third, to discuss money issue and any other problems that may come up with implementation of housing problems. And last but not least, to discuss issue of linkage between international, national, and local standards as practices, as well as monitoring. Ladies and gentlemen, before I give the floor to the first speaker of today's panel, one last thought, which should be as a buggy, as something that we should all be aware of and do everything what we can do to stand up to it. Just when we had the last International Steering Committee in Prague in autumn 2010, Mayor of town Holešov executed his plan of moving socially excluded, mainly Roma, to newly set up module boxes on outskirts of the town. You may remember that 5 years ago we dealt with the similar problem, if not the same case, in town of Vsetín. I do not need to describe you what this change meant and will mean for quality of life of those who need to or had to move. My fear is that mayors of towns throughout Czech Republic, but also elsewhere, will not listen our ideas, speeches, and plans. They will choose the easiest way, which in addition will bring them support of majority. Hence, we need to insist and find any possible legal way to ban this practice of further segregation and deterioration of quality of life. We need to ban the possibility of financing such affordable plastic housing from state or EU funds. We need to constantly remind ourselves that there are some principles that we need to follow, so nicely worded in 10 basic principles on Roma integration that Czech Republic introduced to European Union. I believe that throughout upcoming 2 days, we will discuss different positive practices, as well as preventive steps not to face similar situations again.